Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Fans of the 4.5 million per episode view Longmire show on A&E Netflix have long loved creator Craig Johnson's one-of-a-kind creative mind, from which the lead character, Wyoming Sheriff Walt Longmire, first wrote onto the page nearly 20 years ago in The Cold Dish, and have been following his adventures fervently ever since in bestsellers like Death Without Company, Kindness Goes Unpunished, The Dark Horse, Junkyard Dogs, Another Man's Moccasins, Hell is Empty, Divorce Horse, Christmas in Absaroka County, Messenger, Spirit of Steamboat, Any Other Name, Waiting for Signs, An Obvious Fact, Depth of Winter, and Daughter of a Morning Star, with the New York Times making the esteemed case that it's the scenery and the big guy standing in front of the scenery that keeps us coming back to Craig Johnson's lean and leathery mysteries, which continue to new bestsellers like As the Crow Flies, A Serpent's Tooth, Dry Bones, The Highwaymen, The Western Star, and Land of Wolves. The Christian Science Monitor has admired Johnson's commanding sense of place, captured within each sweeping novel, while the Southern Literary Review recently joked that if you are new to the Longmire series, you might think of Sheriff Longmire as a new age John Wayne in recent hits like Next Last Stand and Hell and Back. Johnson is winner of the Spur Award, the SNCF Mystery of the Year Award, and has his very own Longmire Day in Buffalo, Wyoming. He joins us today from his home to talk about it all. Craig, we're so excited to have you on the program. Thanks again for taking out time to be on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Of all the authors that we've interviewed for the show, you are the first to have a day devoted to your series with Longmire Day. How exciting is that for you, year in and out, to get to interact with your readers, both in terms of the series and the show? I understand it's grown into quite an event.
Yeah, your take on it is pretty good. It's pretty surreal, like that when you get right down to it. I mean, there are surreal moments, in any author's life. There's the surreal moment where, you actually get an agent or you actually get a publisher. And then the real big surrealism is like, of course, whenever you walk into a bookstore and there are your books, stacked up there and ready to go for people to buy. That's weird. That's when you really start thinking, hey, this is serious. This is the real deal. Like, and then if you're lucky enough, if you're fortunate enough, like that, and Hollywood comes knocking on the door like that, and they make a TV show out of your books, and suddenly you're standing there on set watching, actors deliver lines from your books, and that's weird. And then, if you're watching a television show or going into a movie theater and watching your characters, that's weird. Like, and then yeah, having a festival, for a TV show is kind of odd like that. I mean, when it started out very humble beginnings, you got to remember like that. When it started out, the little town that's the basis for Durant in the books is Buffalo, Wyoming, which has a population right at about 5,000 people at the base of the Bighorn Mountains in northern Wyoming. And I used it, as the basis, for Durant, for a number of different reasons. One of them being that, I didn't want it to try and remember everything there was to try and remember about a fictitious locale. And so I thought, well, if I use Buffalo, then maybe, that will work. And so it turned out to be pretty neat. Like that, it worked very, very well, I think, for the whole situation. The city kind of appreciated it. That was kind of nice too. And then, when they started filming, Longmire, on Netflix, like that, the filming all takes place down in New Mexico. So it really didn't have a Wyoming connection like that. And so we decided, well, maybe we could do something that would kind of help, the local economy, the local businesses and everything. And so we decided to do this thing called Longmire Day. And that's all it was. Just one day is how it started out. Like that. And it basically consisted of me sitting in front of an umbrella in front of the Busy Bee Cafe, which does actually exist, like that, and signing books. Well, a couple of hundred people showed up, and we had a wonderful time. I signed books for everybody, and then we finished up, and the folks from the Wyoming Office of Tourism were up here filming a little documentary about it. And so they asked me, they said, well, if we were able to come up with some funding to help get the actors, to Wyoming, do you think you could ask them, to be a part of all of this? And I said, well, I don't know. I could try. I don't know, and give it a shot and see what happens. But which ones? How many of them do you want? And they said all of them. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, that's going to be. I'll ask and see. Well, they did. They all loved the idea of coming up, and it's kind of become tradition. Next year will be our 10th anniversary of Longmire Days, and it's kind of like a FEMA disaster. It's I remember the first year that we had all of the actors here. All the grocery stores ran out of food. All the restaurants ran out of food. All the ATMs and banks ran out of money. And everybody was walking around with their cell phones, holding them up, trying to get service out of the one little tower that was there in Buffalo. And my favorite thing, of course, was to walk up to him and go, "Yeah, why doesn't Walt have a cell phone, huh?" It kind of showed some of the shortcomings of technology in the vast open spaces of the American West. But we had a great time. And it continues on. It'll be our 10th anniversary next year, and hopefully, with all of this COVID stuff behind us, we'll be able to move forward and arrive at some normalcy, with the event next year.
Taking them and viewers just now discovering your show and series back to its roots, where did Sheriff Walt Longmire first ride into your imagination, and how long after that did you name him?
The basic idea is that I was thinking about writing a novel like that, and I had an idea in my head. And of course, you need to populate that novel with some characters to really make it work. And it seemed to me that, an awful lot of crime fiction at that period in time, you got to remember this is about 20 years ago, it was very noir. Everything was noir. It was all gritty, alcoholic detectives in New York or LA, that were burying bodies in the backyard and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, what if you had a guy who was really decent? What if you had a guy who was a really good guy? And I think I stumbled on, to that guy. I do an awful lot of work, with an awful lot of law enforcement. I mean, I do, a lot of events, with national organizations, with local organizations, and a lot of these guys are, and a lot of the women that are involved, they're really decent people. They work really, really hard, and they don't get paid that much, and so they're doing it for the love, of their fellow man, and to try and make sure that it's a level playing field out there for everybody. And a lot of that, constitutes, who and what, Walt Longmire really is. Also, there was a lot of technology. Everything was all technologically driven. And it seemed like everybody was whipping out their cell phones and on their computers and all this kind of stuff. And, when you live in Wyoming, I mean, it's amazing that we're able to have this Zoom call. I don't know if you're aware of that, Jake. This is kind of like an astounding thing we're getting away with here like that. And with the bandwidth that we have in a town of 25. And so things are getting a little bit better as far as the technology is concerned. But there's nothing like nature to kind of remind us of our scale, and where we really are, in the scale of things. And, I'm living right here at the base of these 14,000 foot snow-capped peaks and these incredible distances that you have to travel, to get anything done. I mean, the county that I live in is the size of New Hampshire, and with a very small, sheriff's department that has to cover a lot of ground with limited resources, limited funding. And so it's kind of, I thought it would make the books maybe focus more on character and place, rather than the technology and that kind of stuff. Whenever you're looking for names, the thing you really have to be aware of is the age appropriation. You have to be aware of what were popular names at that period in time. The other thing is there are all kinds of wonderful names that kind of come and go in vogue. And so, whenever I was thinking about the older characters in the books, and, of course, there are older characters than Walt in the books like that, but I had a grandfather named Walter, and I always loved that name. I wish I'd had that name. I had another, grandfather named Lucian like that. And so it's a lot easier, I think, for authors, to kind of cherry pick, names from their families like that they can go back and find the appropriate time period, when that name would have been a popular name, but maybe is not so used nowadays. So that was that was the first one. The second one, a little bit more difficult. I've always been a Charles Dickens fan. I'm a big reader of Charles Dickens. I love classical literature. And one of the things I think Dickens was extraordinary was his ability to find a name that would tell you who that character was before they ever opened their mouth or you got any kind of description about them at all. I mean, when I say the name Scrooge, you don't have to think about who that character is or what he is. You know what he is. And so I thought, well, I've got this guy who's a sheriff, in Wyoming. He's a good guy like that. He's made a lot of sacrifices in his life to be who he is and do what he does. He's made a deal with the universe, to give everybody a level playing field. And for that act, he's had the most important thing in his entire life taken away from him, his wife. And so there will always be a touch of sadness that goes along with that character. And I think that kind of is endemic, with Walt. And I started thinking about how, that sadness would follow him through his life and never completely go away. And I came up with Longmire. Longmire, like it, and that was the name. The other thing you do with the name like that is also you have to, if you want to check and see if it's a good Western name, you just have to stick it before steakhouse. And if it sounds good, then you got a good Western name. Like it. So Longmire Steakhouse seemed to work. Okay, so that was just a joke, Jake. Just a joke.
Still, it's a great tip. Taking viewers back to the beginning of it all with Cold Dish, the book that kicked off the series. How elaborately did you work on Walts' backstory before you began writing, including that he was a college football star, had a degree in English Lit, then became a Marine and served in Vietnam, was an oil worker and eventually elected Absaroka County Sheriff after first serving as deputy sheriff? What kind of research, for instance, did you do into interviewing local law enforcement? And I assume that then went on to inform the case he investigated in the first book.
I didn't have much pressure on me because I wasn't letting anybody know I was writing a book. I think, what I always look at it is I always say to people, wanting to be an author is kind of like wanting to be an astronaut. The odds against you are so great. Don't tell anybody. That way, if you fail, nobody knows. And if you succeed, you're an incredible overnight success, And so I kind of kept my cards close to my vest and didn't really talk to anybody about this book that I was attempting to write. But I did look at it. And the reason I was laughing while you were asking the question is that I get that question and there's always, I have to tell this story like that simply because it's the only way to illustrate, what it was like. I had this idea, about this sheriff of the least populated county and, this case that he was dealing with, where these individuals keep, turning up that they were involved with a rape case that were being killed one by one with a Sharps buffalo rifle. And so I got started on the book and I wrote the first 2 chapters. And I'm sure I'm not the first author to face this particular debacle, but I wrote the first 2 chapters of the book and they were horrible, Jake. They were terrible. And I know nobody knows how horrible they were than me because I wrote them. I know how bad they were. And so I thought, why are these so bad? Why are these chapters so bad? And why does this book suck as badly as it does? And so I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? You don't know enough about rural law enforcement. You need to go in and introduce yourself to a sheriff and talk about it, how they do what they do and, all this. And so I drove the 17 and a half miles into Buffalo, our county seat, and I go into the sheriff's office. You have to remember, this is a while back. There was no, before 9/11, there was no computer rooms. There was no bulletproof glass. None of that stuff. There was like a wooden counter with a guy with his cowboy boots up on the desk at the end of the hallway. I think I was kind of seeing the end of an era, in many ways, with Wyoming sheriffing. And so I, knock on the counter and this voice goes, "What?" And the sheriff comes out and I said, "Hey, Sheriff, you don't know me. My name's Craig Johnson. I've got a little ranch out near Ucross and I'm writing a murder mystery about a Wyoming sheriff. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to help me." And he said, I don't know anything about that. I wouldn't know how to help you or anything like this. I've never done anything like that before. And I said, well, I'm not looking for literary criticism here. I'm looking for, how it is that you would process a homicide investigation, with limited resources and, with vast distance and all this kind of thing. And we talked for a little bit and he said, well, hey, what the heck? I don't know how much help I'm going to be to you, but I'll be happy to give it a shot and see what we can come up with. So I was so excited and so, wrapped with the thought that I had solved my problem that I went home and added on to my house. I built my whole ranch myself. And so I added on to the house. I built a barn. I built a shop, corrals, loading chutes, all these things. And I finally, came back in and got the ranch all up and going. My wife had a store going and I rebuilt an old opera house. Got her store all up and going. And one day I came back into the office and I pull open the third drawer down on the right-hand side. And those 2 lonely little chapters of the Cold Dish were looking up at me. And almost 10 years had gone by. Yeah. So I pull those 2 little chapters out and I'm looking at them and, things are all up and kind of going. And I'm thinking, okay, you always wanted to write a book, and I'm rereading those chapters and they were just as bad as I remembered them being before. And I thought, this is horrifying. You're going to have to go in and you're going to have to talk to that sheriff all over again, reintroduce yourself to him. I knew he was still the sheriff because I'd voted for him 3 times. And so, I thought I'm going to have to do that. Well, I didn't work up the nerve. I didn't have the nerve at first. So I kind of waited a while. And there was one day I went in and I was putting gas in my truck and I'm standing there at the pump island. And all of a sudden this police cruiser pulls in on the other side of the pump island and stops. And this guy gets out and, he starts pumping gas into his cruiser there. And he's looking at me from across the pump island and he pops his hat up like this, and drops his glasses down on his nose and he's looking at me. And he's giving me this look that says, "What did I arrest you for and when was it?" And so I stuck out my hand and I said, "Sheriff Kirkpatrick, you're probably not going to remember me." And he goes, "Your name's Craig Johnson. You're the one that's got the little ranch out near Ucross. You're the one that's writing the murder mystery about the Wyoming sheriff." And I looked at him and I said, That was a 5-minute conversation from 10 years ago. That's absolutely amazing. And he looks at me and he goes, yeah, if you don't mind me saying so, this book of yours is going kind of slow.
Wow, so 10 years had gone by and he still remembered the book?
That pissed me off. Like, I took that one on the chin. And I thought, okay, well, now I'm going to get serious about it. And that's when I doubled down like that and really got started writing it. And I would send, the chapters, to Sheriff Larry, like that, and let him read them and go through the book and try and guess who it was that did it all the way through.
After working on Cold Dish for so long, how quick a path to publication did it have?
I think it's doing anything from Ucross, Wyoming, is going to be a little bit of a trial like that as far as that's concerned. But it was surprisingly easy. It was kind of amazing. I had a good friend like that, and she had some contacts, in New York. And so what I did basically was, make some phone calls and say, I'm going to be in New York. I'd like to stop by the office and drop this, manuscript off if I could. And so I showed up there in New York. It was probably the coldest day in January, in centuries like that. And, had my hat and my boots like that, and, walked into those offices like that and handed off that manuscript. And sometimes, it was horrifying. I would walk up 4 flights and then, knock on the door and they would open it up, exactly, 6 inches, which was about the size of the manuscript. And I would slide it through the door and I would hear, sure, kid, we'll let you know. And then they would disappear and I never heard from them again. But there was one particular agent who was a very, very powerful agent. And if I'd known how powerful and capable she was, maybe I would have chickened out and not even gone and knocked on her door and gone in that office. But I did. And she gave me 10 minutes, which turned into like an hour. And 30 minutes or hour and 45 minutes, like of just talking, about the book, about the writing process, and all of these things. And we just really hit it off like that. And by the time that I got back to the ranch here in Wyoming, she had already called and left a message on the phone machine that said, don't give this to anybody else. I want it. And she's the one that introduced me to Catherine Court over at Penguin and Viking. And they bought the Cold Dish, the very first book in the series. And they were the ones that took me aside and said, we think you have a series here. We think that people are going to want to know more about these characters and about this place. And that's when I said to the president of Penguin, well, I don't think that's a very good idea, but I got some other ideas for you. And she said, why don't you go back to your ranch and think about this? And so I did like that. And as I intimated before, like at the first draft of the Cold Dish was about 650 pages long. It was like War and Peace in Absaroka County was what it was like. And so on the first round of editing, I had to take out, at least, a good, 200 pages, out of that book, which I did, and it made it a much, much better book. And I learned, a valuable lesson, in the editing of that book. And then I thought, okay, well, there are a lot of backstories, and a lot of information, a lot of characters, got dropped simply because they didn't fit, in that first novel. And I thought it'd be a shame for them to be lost forever. And then I thought, okay, well, you idiot, nobody else is going to write this. Maybe you better write another book about them. And so that was 17 books ago. Here I am, 17 books down the road. And I never would have thought, that it would have gone this far like that. But I think the key element there is that you have to have a character who is interested in the world and has facets to their character and a place, that allows you to advance those characters and continue changing and not becoming formulaic, which I think is just the death of any series.
We meet some of Longmire's mainstay co-stars in the next couple books that follow. Death Without Company and Kindness Goes Unpunished, including Henry Standing Bear, Deputy Victoria Morietti, Marie Baroja, former Sheriff Lucien Connolly, and others from the early books. Please talk about any you would in terms of favorites and also advice for building out a really strong supporting cast.
Well, I think in many ways, whenever you're looking at the ensemble of a book, I always tell students, I always say, it's kind of like, it's like conducting a choral group is what it is. Each one of those voices is there for a specific reason. And you need to think about that before, you populate your novel with these characters like that. Because, if you've got a character who's there that's basically just mimicking, your protagonist, that character is not going to be very helpful like that. Or if you've got characters that all agree, with your protagonist, or from the same place, born in the same place, grew up in the same place, they're really not illustrating something new, and so, obviously some of the bigger characters, with Victoria Moretti, she's the outsider, she's a career cop from Philadelphia, for goodness sake. So she doesn't know all the insider information that would come from being born, growing up, and having your entire law enforcement career be in Wyoming. And so she gives me a window of opportunity for the reader, because not everybody that reads my books is going to be from Northern Wyoming like that. And so, I'm able to use her to ask questions, about, simple things like, why are there only can-only bars on the Powder River? And the answer to that is because you can't have bottles because people throw them. And then, of course, her question to that is, yeah, well, what if you throw a full can of beer? And Walt's response to that would be, no one on the Powder River has ever thrown a full can of beer ever like that, And so, you wouldn't have opportunities like that if you didn't have that outsider to, exemplify that voice like that from the much larger population of the world. Henry's the same thing. He comes from a very specific world up there on the reservation like that, and he is able to illustrate, and explain, and a lot of things that that maybe people would not be aware of, like that, as far as life on the res is concerned. Lucian Connolly, once again, like that, we need a mirror into, or a viewer into the past. We need some kind of a window into the past of when Walt first started, or what was in before Walt was ever a sheriff or knew what was going on, in Absaroka County and those type of things. All of them are just voices that you use, and they need to be very differentiated. They need to be very, very different. I'm not a big fan of the tag phrases, he said, she said. I think that the characters' voices should be so differentiated and so defined that as soon as they start talking, who that character is. The one that I use that people comment on the most is like Henry Standing Bear does not use contractions in the books like that. And so, it's him when he's talking. Vic has somewhat colorful language, and, it's very easy to pick her out, whenever you start reading the books, and then, Walt's the backbone, Walt's the narrative of the stories. But I think that's a lot of it there. I like first person for a number of different reasons. I think there's an energy to that, that I think works, better than any other. I mean, some of the best stories I've ever heard, were over a campfire at a hunting camp, or, riding along, trailing along behind 200 head of cattle or something, where somebody turns around and looks at you and says, let me tell you what happened to me last month. Well, right then you've got somebody who was there, and the energy is there, because the way they tell that story, it's very, very personal and compelling to them. The other thing it does, like, especially like it with crime fiction, is it puts your reader on the same footing as your protagonist. When you start using those third person deals where you're jumping around with information, if only they had known that, and that's just the epitome of bad writing as far as I'm concerned, and so, it makes it a lot easier, I think, like a little bit more compelling like that. And then, the information that Walt gets in the book is that the reader is getting it the exact same time that Walt's getting it. Because, one of the things you have to do when you write in this particular genre is play fair. You can't introduce a character, in the, 23rd chapter and suddenly have them pop into the book and be the bad guy. I mean, they have to have been around and been a suspect for a while. Like, and so that's, I think, another one of the reasons there. As far as the voices are concerned, it's always tough when you first start a book because you think, those voices pretty well like that. But then you get a little further down the road and a few more years of writing those voices, and you get a little bit more distilled, in the process. But and I have theories about the voices in your head symptoms like it. I don't know about you, Jake, but it worries me. People sit in a room by themselves and hear voices like it. I got a theory on that. This is my own psychological. I'm going way out here on a limb, on the psychology of this like that. But what I think that basically is that your conscious mind is really kind of responsible for an outline, doing the research, fingers on the keyboard, that type of thing. Well, your subconscious mind is kind of like a backseat passenger. It can't reach the steering wheel or the accelerator or the brakes or anything. And so, but it's still privy, to all of the information that your conscious mind has. And so I think an awful lot of time, your subconscious mind kind of plays the part of being a backseat driver. And so you'll be, whistling along there with your own storyline, like it. And then all of a sudden your subconscious mind says, yeah, what about this? And throws that over the seat. And, whenever authors say, like, oh, well, the characters just speak to me and they go off on their own and do this. Well, it's just your subconscious mind, that wants to be, it wants to have a say, in the story like that. And I think that's perfectly natural and perfectly normal like that. If I start wandering through the house here at the ranch hearing voices like that, I'll let you know.
At the same time, you've always kept fans turning the pages equally entertained with the characters and cases that Longmire and his team are investigating. Whether we're talking about the murder of 2 teens who raped a local Indian girl in the cold dish, the poisoning death of Marie Baroja in Death Without Company, Walt's daughter Katie's vicious attack in Philadelphia that leaves her in a coma, and Longmire out for justice teaming up with the Philadelphia PD and Kindness Goes Unpunished. A Vietnamese girl's murder that spans 40 years total in the course of the investigation in another man's moccasins, and the truly fascinating case in the Dark Horse, where Longmire goes undercover to uncover whether a woman really shot her husband 6 times in the head. And no fan could forget the severed thumb found in the junkyard with broader implications, with a beef between developers and the Stewart junkyard crew who doesn't want to move in Junkyard Dogs, or Hell is Empty, just to name a few. What's your favorite part of flexing Longmire's investigative instincts in the course of a given case? Really what we're talking about here is that unspoken intuition he has that really can't be taught.
It's always the one you're working on, no matter what the facet, whether it's like, the enjoyment of the writing, doing the research, the characters, where they are in development. It's always the one that you're writing on right now. Because that's the one that you're absorbed in. That's the one that you're like, kind of sunk into, look at, and getting your teeth into like that. But yeah, that's always the challenge like that, because, you have a social issue, a message that you're trying to get across. And then you have to think, okay, well, what's a plot? What's a vehicle that's going to make this work? You have to kind of put those things together, because you don't want to get on there and lecture people for 200, 300, or 350 pages. You want to have an entertaining story that's going to illustrate, that issue or that message that you've got. Then you also look at it as, one of those things where you say to yourself, okay, where are the characters right now? Where are they? And what kind of an effect is this going to have on them? And is this the kind of, effect I want to have on their lives right now? That's a big issue. And not only with Walt, but also with a lot of those support characters that we were discussing. That's, kind of essential to that part of the process too. Then I have certain things that, are problems for me that, I've inflicted upon myself. One is that I was talking to, the much loved author Tony Hillerman a number of years back when I first started. And I had a short story that was in Cowboys and Indians magazine, Old Indian Trick. And one of the great things was if you won, you got to go have dinner with Tony Hillerman. And I had a big 4-hour dinner with Tony because he was just an old Oklahoma cowboy. And we really hit it off and had a grand time like that. And I said, I don't remember even which book he was on whenever it was that I was working on my second and was kind of worried, about how you do this and everything. And I asked him, I said, how do you do this? How do you make it fresh every time? And his response was, he says, well, at the expense of sounding like a bad, sports analogy, you got to play them up one at a time. You got to approach each one as if it's, completely unique and unto itself. And he says, and then the other thing is you need to kind of maybe find a little bit of a framework that you want to work with, that'll give you some semblance, of this world. And I started thinking about it and I thought, okay, well, what's the biggest thing that has an effect, on us here, in the American West, and my answer to that immediately was the weather. The weather is the thing that has the biggest effect. There isn't any ranching family practically in Wyoming that hasn't had somebody go out to feed cattle or, go out to look for cows or something and, in a blizzard and never made it back. And so I started thinking about it and I thought I'm going to pull a Vivaldi is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the 4 seasons. It'll take like 4 books to get through 1 year of Walt's life. And it turned out to be a good decision like that, because January in Wyoming is nothing at all like July in Wyoming. Like it. And so even if I am talking about a very specific, geography for my books, the environment changes a great deal like that. And so that was kind of helpful to the process too. There's a great quote from the Northern Cheyenne that you judge a man by the strength of his enemies. And I think that's one of the philosophies that I kind of approach the books with. In that, I don't want Walt going up against, cardboard characters, that are like twirling their, mustaches, or anything like that. I want him going up against people like that. And the thing I'm always taking into consideration is that, in any given art form, like the bad guys don't consider themselves to be bad guys. The example that I always take into consideration is Richard III. Richard III in Shakespeare's play does not think that he is a bad guy. He thinks he's been maligned and abused, and it's time for some payback. And and he's not going to be stopped. And so I think I look at that an awful lot of the time and try and give those characters their say. Try and give them the ability to stand, and cover the ground that they stand on. One of my favorite emails to get, after a book is whenever someone will write me and they'll say, I did not like this character like that, but I fully understood why it is that they did what they did like that. And of course that puts Walt in the position of, having to bring to justice, an awful lot of the times, some people that, he looks and understands why it is they did what they did. And it was a terrible, terrible mistake that they made, but there are great hopes that, that maybe they can turn themselves around. And sometimes that's not the case like that. And then sometimes, he comes up against some individuals like that are, pretty ruthless like that. And he has to stand the ground like that, and be that wall, as they say. I think it might've been Churchill like that, but the ones where that we sleep well at night because rough men stand on the walls and protect us. And I think Walt's probably one of those men. The fun thing is that he's so smart. People are always asking me, if I'm Walt Longmire, and my wife has the best response to that. Her response to that is, Walt is who Craig would like to be in 10 years. He's just off to an incredibly slow start. And there's probably more truth to that than I'm willing to admit. But there are things that Walt has that I think are just, I truly aspire to. I did grow up with a father who had a photographic memory, literally. He could read a line, he could read a page of text and then just, repeat it back to you verbatim. He could take anything apart and put it all back together. I remember, finding him in our garage. He'd taken an automatic transmission apart and he looked up at me. And the first thing I was a child, he looked up at me and he said, "Nothing is ever as complicated as it first looks." And that's kind of like the hallmark for Walt. In many ways, I gave him, some of those gifts that my father had. I've got a photographic memory. I just can't get it developed. And so, I used some of those, those tools and gave them, to Walt. And he has that ability, he has that ability to not be intimidated under just about any situation, whether physically, intellectually, it doesn't matter. He'll take it on. And that, is kind of surprising like that, because sometimes the stereotypes, of a rural sheriff, are the big pot belly and the chrome glasses and all of this. And there's nothing Walt loves better than for people to underestimate him and think that he's just some rube cowboy sheriff that they can get something over on, because that puts him in a dreadfully advantageous position.
When you take a page turner like As the Crow Flies, where Walt teams up with Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation Chief Lolo Long to solve the case of a mother who plunged to her death off a cliff with a baby in her arms, it's not just the characters and the cases, but the backdrops throughout Wyoming and North Dakota among a wide terrain of beautiful lands and landscapes that really become co-stars in these books. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. It has to be like that. And you were talking about earlier on like that, what were the first kind of ideals or first imageries that I had, for Walt Longmire. And, one was this singular vertical, individual standing on a horizontal background. The way I described it in one of the books is that the landscape of Wyoming in many ways, it hurts to look at it because it pulls at the corners of your eyes, and makes you, see all of it. You can see the world. And then there's Walt, standing there vertically, in opposition, maybe not so much to nature like that, but in opposition to wrong. And that's what a lot of that character is. And then, people make fun of me every once in a while. I'll get an email from somebody who says, "Does it always snow in your books?" And I'm like, "Hey, I write about Wyoming. I don't write about Key West, So, there's a lot. We have two seasons. We have winter and the 4th of July. That's pretty much it, And so there's a lot of snow. We're probably going to have a snow here in about a week, probably.
At the same time, it's not like things stay one-dimensional for Longmire within the enemy he's hunting or the circumstances he's dealing with along the way to getting justice, with the complicated twists and turns. Say, for example, fans encounter in Serpent's Tooth, where Longmire has to juggle a cult of polygamists, the CIA, an oil conglomerate, and a really bloody confrontation with a Mexican drug cartel that has bloody ends for his deputies. Or any other name where readers are taken on no less a dizzying ride and read with a dead detective, a ring of international hitmen, deadwood casinos, snowy lodges, and on till its riveting ending. Any secrets you'd share with fans on where you come up with these wild story ideas, book in and out?
Well, I guess I'm laughing like that just because in that particular book, when you were talking about the different facets like that were involved in the book, almost all of them came from newspapers from Wyoming and Montana. They were actually cases, and that's one of the dirty little secrets about my books also is that, one of the great joys that I take, in writing the books is that, I don't ever want to have Walt chasing Al Qaeda in Crook County. I don't want to ever have Walt on a cruise ship. I want Walt dealing with the things that, are, that the Western sheriffs are actually dealing with. And I laugh like that because the more outrageous things that are in my books, that every once in a while someone will take umbrage with, and write me and say, well, there's no way that could ever possibly happen. And I'm like, well, okay, you need to take a look at the Billings Gazette, and here's the date, and find out, because this is actually a case that happened. I'm sorry to break the news to you like that. And so an awful lot of the dirty little secret is I'm constantly going around in Montana and Wyoming, Colorado, South Dakota, and plucking up little independent newspapers, little weekly newspapers like that, and and cutting out articles like that and putting them away in a file folder, so that I can use them for fodder, later on like that. And I think that does a number of different things. I think the first thing it does is, obviously, each issue is going to be different. Like the other thing it does is that there's an honesty to that. Walt is dealing with the things that Western sheriffs are dealing with like that. And it kind of keeps an honesty in the books, whereas if I was just like picking some strange thing up, and just throwing it at Walt just for the fun of it to see what his response would be, that'd be a little odd after a while.
There's a discovery of a T-Rex skeleton and dry bones that leads to an ugly murder mystery that follows. Was that based on an actual dinosaur they found out in Wyoming?
There was. Her name was Sue, and she's actually at the Chicago Museum of Natural History. And that was exactly the way it played out. Like that, this rancher, found the largest, most complete, Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton, on his property. Well, the problem is he was an Indian rancher like that. So not only was he party to this, but the tribe was party to this. Well, then they discovered that the land where it had been discovered was actually, on a lease property from the federal government. So it was not only the rancher, not only the tribe, but also the federal government, and everybody got involved and wanted a piece of this thing because it was going to go for millions and millions of dollars like that. And so I just, when I first read about that, I was like, oh, that just sounds like a Walt Longmire all to pieces like that. And as it turned out, it was, and put Walt in a situation where he, was dealing with, maybe a subject matter that he was aware of and relatively knowledgeable of, but certainly not an expert in.
Fans have long loved the relationship between Walt and his daughter Katie, and now his granddaughter Lola. What have been any of your favorite aspects of revisiting or expanding that relationship by new generations and ties book in and out?
Oh, watching it evolve. I mean, watching it evolve, as their relationship, goes from, when the books first start, she's kind of like this disembodied, phone message, from Philadelphia, and so she's almost like a ghost, and she is in many ways a ghost of his, previous relationship with his wife. And even when he hears her voice on the phone, it sounds like his wife. And, or he calls and leaves a message, and listens to her voice on the phone machine. It's almost like he's being, haunted, to a certain extent. And then there's also, a little bit of distance, between the two of them. Obviously, the 2,000 miles between the two of them, with her, being in Philadelphia and being a lawyer like that, and Walt being a sheriff in Wyoming. But I didn't want him to have that comfort of having her near when I first started the books. And then, as the relationship evolves and it goes forward, then it became a little bit, more interesting like that, the point where she actually moves back, to Wyoming like that and becomes an assistant district attorney down in Cheyenne like that. And then she has a child, and then she gets married like that. And things happen like that. And then she has a child, and all of these things are happening. And so the recuperation of that particular relationship as time goes on, has been a joy for me to see how it develops. Hold on. Sure. My wife will grab that, I'm sure. She did. But a lot of it is like watching the evolution of that relationship and seeing how Katie becomes older, is a parent. There's actually a portion in Daughter of the Morning Star, the newest book, where Walt calls her just to hear her voice and talk to her. And she's having a battle, with Walt's granddaughter, Lola, getting her to eat breakfast and feeding her tapioca pudding. And Walt questions, the validity of giving your child tapioca pudding for breakfast, and then realizes he has made a dreadful, dreadful mistake in second guessing his daughter about his granddaughter. So probably a lot of that, the more personal aspects of his life.
Beyond that, there's really an extended family of long-term and recent co-stars that have expanded Walt's circle of confidants. From early books through later ones like An Obvious Fact, The Western Star, Depp the Winner, and Land of Wolves, among others, or novellas like Divorce Horse, Messenger, Christmas in Absaroka County, Wait for Signs, Spirit of the Steamboat, and The Highwaymen. Whether we're talking about advisor Virgil White Buffalo, Undersheriff Victoria Morietti, Retired Sheriff Lucien Connolly, Omar Rhodes, Dog, Henry Standing Bear, Deputy Sheriff Zachary Zach Heflin, Annie the Ferg Ferguson, and Branch Connolly, among others. Is it like a big reunion when you get them all back together for a new book?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I mean, you've got a group of individuals like that who, they may all be on the same department like that, but many times in a sheriff's department, it's going to be a loose coalition of warring tribes. There are a lot of facets involved like that. And then, with the younger characters coming up, obviously they've got abilities and skills like that Walt doesn't have. And that, goes back a little bit as far as you were talking about the voices. Are concerned. Like I've got a Basque deputy like that's in the department, Santiago Cesar Vitoria, and we have a very large Basque population, here at the base of the Bighorn Mountains here in Wyoming, and so Walt's not Basque, like, and so for him to be able to understand that language and understand that culture, even an ocean apart, he needed an interpreter. And so it was interesting to have, that character be involved there. It was also interesting because he's kind of computer savvy. He really understands all this stuff. Well, that is something that Walt will never be. In Land of Wolves, they make the terrible mistake of giving Walt a new computer, and it doesn't turn out well, like and so in a lot of ways, like that's just more facets to give more of a sense of ensemble, I think, for an awful lot of the characters, and that will continue like that because there's always going to be an ebb and a flow. Freimeyer, he gets killed, during the sword, during the stories like that. Cesar Vitoria is in and out, from the things that he's dealing with like that. And then we have a new dispatcher on weekends, Barrett Long, like that, who's Northern Cheyenne, who started working on weekends now like that. And so, that's, I think, an honest portrayal of a sheriff's department. There's an ebb and a flow.
When you look at Next to Last Stand, where Longmire is sent to investigate an art heist, or the most recent release, Daughter of the Morning Star, please give fans a look inside where you draw muse from these days after writing this series for nearly 20 years.
It came from seeing that damn poster on every bar and every restaurant wall in the American West, for goodness sake. It's what they comically refer to as the Budweiser painting. It was a painting by Cassili Adams, like that he did, that they toured, maybe about 10 years after the actual Battle of the Little Bighorn back in 1876. And it was finally purchased by Anheuser-Busch. And Augie Busch made posters of it. At one point in time, was sending out I think 1 million posters a year for anybody that was selling Budweiser beer, and sticking this poster up on the wall. Well, I know 30 miles from where my ranch is, literally, it's my town of 25, 30 miles in any distance, I can find you 5 of those that are up on the wall. At any given restaurant or bar or saloon or anything. And so I've seen it my whole life. And so then I saw that there was a collection of essays by Norman MacLean, the much acclaimed author of A River Runs Through It and Young Men in Fire, fabulous writer like that. And he had done a collection of essays about Custer. And one of the essays was about the painting. And so I remember reading that essay and deciding, I have to do some more research on this painting. Well, the history of the painting was equally as dramatic as, the historical event that it portrays. And I thought, okay, well, wait a minute, I read about it burning at Fort Bliss at the 7th Cavalry headquarters and all of this. And so I called up some friends, over at the Buffalo Bill Center for the West over in Cody, like it's one of the most eminent, art, Western art museums, in the world. And I asked them, I said, if that painting were to turn up, how much would it be worth? And they said, 25, 30. And I was like, $25,000, $30,000. And they were like, no, $25-30 million, Craig. They said with the impact that painting has had and the number of people that have seen it, it's actually been referred to as maybe the most viewed, not the highest quality, but the most viewed painting, in American history. And they said, yeah, about 25-30 million dollars. And I thought, well, there you go. That kind of brings this, this art heist kind of home for Walt. And then of course, then it became, once again, trying to find a vehicle, for it. I mean, the Little Bighorn's only about an hour and a half up the road, from where my ranch is. But then I started thinking about it, and there is the Wyoming Soldier and Sailors Home, which is now the home for Veterans Home, like that down here in Buffalo, about 20 miles away. And I remember those old guys sitting out there, in their wheelchairs, and waving at traffic, and I'm a sucker for a good story. So I would stop and talk to those guys and maybe even smuggle them a little Rainier beer every once in a while like that. And, we'd sit and talk. And at that period in time, when I first started building the ranch, there were still guys up there that had fought in World War II, for goodness sake, like getting Korean War veterans, Vietnam veterans. And a lot of that I thought, would really strike Walt, it would really hit home, with him being an investigator, in the Marines and in Vietnam, with him having served, I thought, him looking at those guys, like it's going to have an impact on him. And I thought that might be the key element, to telling this particular story. And I think that some of the questions you've asked, very insightful as far as like probing and finding, exactly what that is. I think, you got to have a good story. You got to have a message. You got to say to yourself at the beginning, what are you trying to say? I think an awful lot of, beginning authors, run into the problem of not thinking that clearly, thinking through that, before they get started. And then they get on that road and they forgot why it was that they started writing this book, this 350 page, opus, that you're going to loose upon the world. That's a long ride, and you need a map every once in a while to kind of remind you, what it is you're doing and why. So I think a lot of that, is important. I think, you have to have freedom. I'm very, very fortunate, to be with Viking Penguin Publishing. Like that, they're a grand house. Like that, they're a very literary house. They don't have that many, mystery authors, and I'm fortunate enough to be one of them. But even more fortunate in the sense that they really don't have any kind of predicate or codicils that they have as far as telling me what I should do or how I should do it. I can go in any direction and write about anything that I want to write about. I think, when I first started out, they wanted a couple of sentences, and then the first contract that I signed, after the cold dish, it said that it must be a mystery and have Walt Longmire in it. That's it. That was the only major considerations that I had to take in, whenever I was writing one of the novels. I had to have Walt and had to be a mystery. Like, well, that's a lot of leeway. You can go in a lot of different directions and a lot of different ways, after that. And I think that the freedom, is a lot of it, to have that freedom to be able to do anything you want to do, however you want to do it, and know that the publisher's got your back. The other thing is that, I've talked about the structure a little bit, but another thing you kind of have to take into consideration when you're writing, I'm not writing about a New York detective, with a caseload of 60 homicides. I'm talking about a rural sheriff in Wyoming. Well, I can only have so many murders, in Durant before, Durant, Wyoming becomes murder capital #1, and so, to kind of relieve, some of that pressure, I started, doing them almost like a ball team. It's almost like a baseball team in the sense that I have home and away games is what I have. There'll be, one book where Walt is in Durant and in Absaroka County, and then I'll have an away, where Walt will be somewhere else. I've taken him, as far flung places as, Philadelphia, Vietnam in 1968. I've taken him all over the place like that, and I never want him to lose, where it is that he's from and the place that started these books. But then again, I also want to stretch it out a little bit and have him, in places where, the environs change a little bit. And then once again, where he doesn't have quite the resources that he normally has. And certainly Daughter of the Morning Star is that. It takes place almost entirely up in Montana. Well, it's not that far away, but it does take place on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, which is a sovereign nation unto itself with its own police force, its own courts, everything. Like it's a completely different world. And so, Walt's, in that different world, exercising, his detecting abilities like that. And Daughter of the Morning Star deals a lot, with the plight of murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is, I think, one of the blights in Indian country right now. That there's such an incredible amount of women. I think that the FBI came out with a report. That more than 5,560 Native women went missing or were killed in the last year. Well, when you take into consideration what the percentages are that they make up, of the population, that's horrific. That's absolutely horrifying. And so it became, an important cause for me to kind of deal with. But then it became also a question of, okay, well, how are you going to deal with this? And that's when I started thinking about the girls' basketball team that I had seen play up in Lame Deer. And just how ferocious those games were like that. And I thought, okay, there's something to be said here as far as that's concerned like that. And that kind of like lent me the opportunity to try and write this book.
How does it work creatively when you're batting around ideas for Walt's next adventure? Say the one fans might be reading in an upcoming book.
for me, I don't know how it is with a lot of other authors like that, but for me, it's like a horse race. I've always got like about a half a dozen ideas that are jockeying for position, to be the next book, and like I said, all those things that you take into consideration when you're choosing up that next book. But that they're generally, I'll have a leader, that will break from the pack, and go forward like that. And then you think about, once again, where are these characters? What are they doing? Is this a home away? Is this a winter book? Is this a summer book? Is it fall? Is it spring? All of these things like that. And so all of them, kind of come into, an opportunity. The other thing is like the big one for me, and I'm really happy that, that you've mentioned it a couple of times here, like during the interview, what's different? Why do I want to write this book, and why is it going to be so completely different from all of the other books that I've done before? After writing 17 books, what's going to make this one special? What's going to make this one completely different from all of the others before? And I don't know, I can't get into too much detail. You're right. But what is it that's going to make this one so completely different from any of the others before? The only thing I can throw out would be, what if Walt Longmire was to wake up in the middle of an unknown town out in the street during a blizzard and stumble up onto the sidewalk and not know where he is, or more importantly, not remember who he is? Where do we go to from there?
Do you tend to get your titles at the beginning of one of these journeys or more toward the end?
I usually will have a working title, for each book. And it's about a 50-50 opportunity. If about 50% of them end up with the working title, the others, what I always say is as well as I do, being a writer, like that, you think you know what a book is about, but you don't know what the book is about until you get to the end. It's like thinking, a trip, to a place you've never been. Yeah, you've been on the internet. Yeah, you got your AAA books. You got your, coffee table books, and you've looked at the photographs, you've read the books and all this stuff like that, but you haven't been there. And so until you get there, that's when you find out, what the kind of the pith and the marrow, of the book is about. And, I like to be a little bit philosophical with those like that and try and let them have a couple of different meanings. Well, until you know what those meanings are, you're kind of at a disadvantage. But then finally at the end, it'll become clear. Generally it'll be a remark or a statement or a phrase that's used somewhere within the book, and it'll come to me and be the one that I choose.
As a Longmire fan who's long wanted to know, have any of Walt's horses had names?
Longmire's horse? Well, he's had a couple like during the course of the book series, like and then I'm not sure like in the television series. I don't think the horse actually had a name. I don't believe like that, which is kind of endemic of Walt to a great extent, because Walt has a house that's not finished. He has a dog that doesn't have a name. He's kind of like Sheriff Interruptus, in many ways. Like with the death of his wife, there are an awful lot of things, about him that maybe will never be finished, that maybe we'll never know. And I think that's part of that. I think that like I said, his house will never probably get done, for goodness sake, like and I feel for him along those lines, because I think that's kind of like my house to a certain extent, Well, also, those are opportunities. Whenever you don't know certain things, about a character. For 17 books, I've touched on Walt's parents, but I've never really had a book that dealt, with, their relationship with not only themselves, but with him, what they were, really like. We've had little excerpts where we've seen, Walt fishing with his father, where he's, having a picnic with his mother when he was a child, little things like that. But I've never really gone into, a lot of detail. Well, that book is coming up. Like there's also a tumultuous relationship between Walt and his grandfather. And that's coming up. Like that's one of the ones that's coming up. That's I think the beauty of a long-term series. You have that luxury of being able to circle back around, like and find those facets where you might have left yourself a bookmark, where you started to tell a story, but knew that, okay, this is way too much of a story as a sidebar, to this particular novel. So it's probably a novel unto itself somewhere down the road. And I like doing that. I love circling back around and finding storylines that I can pick back up, threads, characters, all of those things, because I think what that does is it makes much more of a tapestry of all of your books, where it's all kind of woven together, as opposed to all of them just being one chunk. There actually is a feel of that tapestry where they're all woven together in a much broader sense.
You've been nominated for and won your share of awards, including being a multi-Dillies Award finalist and taking home the Wyoming Historical Association's Book of the Year Award, and the Western Writers of America's Spur Award for Best Novel, and the Mountain and Plains Award for Fiction Book of the Year. Do you have any favorites among these?
Well, it's always nice to get awards. It's always nice, like at that, whenever people respond to what it is you do, like that. But it's also nice to get good reviews, like that, and that type of thing too. And wonderful. The probably the best though is whenever you're on book tours, like somebody walks up, shakes your hand, and says, this was a great book. I really enjoyed this. I love the characters, and this was just a wonder. I'm getting a lot of emails nowadays, from people who are like stuck in COVID, and they can't get out and do the things they want to do, and a lot of emails from people saying like these books basically, kind of saved my life. Like, the humor and the humanity, that Walt has, it's kind of pulled me through in many ways like that. And there was an editorial actually in the New York Times, a marvelous young woman that wrote when she got COVID. One of the things she did was, she started, watching the television show Longmire, which led her to reading the books like that. And she said, what I really love about the books is that there's a decency and it seems like the good guys win. And, that's kind of helped me go, a lot further than maybe I would have if I hadn't had that. And that's pretty marvelous. To be specific and answer to your question, and the reason why I laughed when you said it was there's actually a French award that the train SNCF gives out, which is their award for the best mystery novel. And when you can get an award for best mystery novel of the year from the French train system, I was like, that's kind of cool. Like I was kind of thinking that was kind of nice, I had to admit.
Speaking of COVID, as tragic as this pandemic has been, for those fans of the show stuck at home, they got to binge Longmire on Netflix along with a whole new generation of viewers. Going back in time, how were you first approached about turning the show into a TV series? How involved were you, for instance, from season 1 on in the productions? And what did you think of Robert Taylor as Longmire when he was first cast?
I remember, whenever Warner Brothers and Greer Shepard, and John Coveney and Hunt Baldwin, they were all talking to me about, these were the producers that were talking to me about the possibility of, making it into a television show. And my immediate question was, I was kind of questioning their intelligence because I said, you guys really want to make a TV show about the sheriff of the least populated county in the least populated state in America? And I remember Greer laughing and she goes, well, yeah, we think it's something different. We think it's something new. But we also think that, that Walt kind of captures something that, that people maybe have a little bit of a longing for. And you kind of spoke to that a little bit as far as the COVID response is concerned. We've kind of been going through that anti-hero thing for, since the 60s, for goodness sake, like that, and that's some really wonderful, cinema, some really wonderful literature and all of that. But maybe we've gone to that well enough. Maybe it was time, for, a really kind of a blue chip, kind of solid, good guy. And, not that Walt's perfect in any way. He has tons of faults like that, but he's always going to try and do the right thing like that. And Greer Shepard was the one. She said, I think that, that everybody's kind of ready for that kind of guy. And as it turned out, we're still, one of the top 10 original content shows on Netflix, even as we speak, 4 years after ceasing production. And that's kind of amazing.
You're known for answering every one of your emails personally from fans. When you get those with writing advice, what kind of answers do you reply with?
Oh, I think the big thing is that you really kind of have to be, honest with yourself and true to yourself. I mean, don't ever think, okay, what's going to sell? Don't ever think, what are they going to make a movie out of or things like that? Because generally that tripe, that train has already left the station by the time, you read about it or whatever. You really need to find, what it is that's going to express what it is you want to express and be true to your, not only your own imagination and your own intellect like that, but, what it is that you feel the world kind of needs. In many ways like that. And that's kind of a North Star that'll keep you going in a direction much better than, gee whiz, where are my Amazon ratings, or, gee whiz, when are they going to put that bulletin, that billboard up, with my character on it, on Hollywood Boulevard or something like that. That's kind of silly stuff like that. I mean, you're going to spend more time with those characters in a room by yourself than you're ever going to spend, having lunch with Lou Diamond Phillips, so you better get used to the idea of sitting down and just, working for a living.
Finally, before we go, when you look back over the territory that you've covered with Walt and Company over the past 2 decades and counting, what makes you proudest of the dream you've seen come true over and over again with each new book in this still long-running series?
The only hope that I had, financially or even, in popularity was I hoped that I would be able to sell enough books that I would be able to continue writing books. That was the only motivation that I had, as far as that kind of thing is concerned. I just, wanted to be able to continue, because after you write that first one, boy, it gets a little addicting. You really, if you really enjoy it, I mean, and that's part of it. I mean, I think you really have to enjoy the process. You have to enjoy the work, not just the frills and the icing, that go along with it, because that stuff comes and goes like that. But that work, that blank page, it'll be staring at you every morning. And I think that you have to develop a certain ferocity. One of my favorite quotes is the one from Pablo Picasso, like that. He was in an interview one time and they asked him, they said, well, do you ever get intimidated, by that blank canvas? And he said, that blank canvas better be afraid of me every morning. And, and that's the way I like to approach it. I think you got to look at that blank page and go, here we go. I hope you're ready because, boy, I know I am.
Craig, thank you so much for taking out time to be with us today. It's been a real pleasure having you on About the Authors TV.
You betcha.